So today we're going to give our first public talk about the Chough, and we're calling it Chough Chats just for fun alliteration. We also have a newsletter which is called Chough Chatter. If anyone has any other Chough related alliteration, please, we would take all your suggestions. So this is the first of a series of talks. This is a very general talk, and then we will be having talks late in the coming months are on more specific topics. So if this is something you do enjoy and you'd like to know more detail, then sort of stick around and we'll be doing more of these. So as mentioned, I'm Alicia, and we also have Julia, and we'll have others joining us at the end. Right. So some of you, as you've turned up today, may already know loads of this, so feel free to ignore me and do something else for a minute. But for those of you who maybe don't know, so today we're talking about the red-billed chough, which is this fella down at the bottom. Now they're a member of the crow family, the rarest member that we have in the UK. And their Latin name is really fun. It's Paracorax paracorax, which means, I'm never sure if it's raven, if it's fire raven or fire crow, but either way, the pyro is the fire, which is really cool because of their red beak. So they used to live in Kent. They used to be all over the coastline of Kent, but about 250 years ago, they went extinct in Kent through a combination of factors that we'll talk about in a lot more detail, but predominantly persecution, so people persecuting them, and habitat loss. Now, as we will also show you a fun map, they are found in some other places in the UK, but them finding their way back to Kent by themselves is really unlikely because they're quite a sedentary species, so they don't really travel that much in their lifespan. They can live up to 16 years, and as we'll talk about in a lot more... Stop it! I'm just going to mute the puppies. As we'll talk about, in a lot more detail, they're closely linked to maritime chalk grassland, which we see a lot of in certain parts of Kent that we'll be talking about. Corax is raven, somebody says. Oh, wonderful. Right. So the chough, they're sort of crow-sized member of the crow family with this really vivid black coat, and then they have this really vivid red beak and red feet, and you can also see that they have these broad, deeply fingered wings. Juliet, did you want to add anything here?
Yeah, so they're about 39 to 40 centimetres long in the body, and their wingspan's about 73 to 90 centimetres, and they typically weigh somewhere around 350 grams. So yeah, a difference to notice in flight, apart from those red feet that stand out there, is that they have these really deeply fingered wings at the end versus the more paddle-shaped wings that you might see on a jackdaw. And I've got the chough call here to play for you, so hopefully, or Alicia, you might have to. Yeah.
You ready? No. Again. Aha.
Yeah. So chough was apparently originally an alternative onomatopoeic name for the jackdaw. You can kind of hear it going, cheer, cheer. And it was initially known in Cornwall as the Cornish chough, but then just became shortened to chough as we call it today.
So I'm going to talk broadly about the chough, but something we're going to talk about in a lot more specifics is the red-billed Chough Project that myself and Julia and others are working on, which is a partnership project between Kent Wildlife Trust, who Julia and I work for, and the Wildwood Trust, who their representatives will be joining us later. So in 2018, the two organisations established a new partnership to deliver a shared vision for a wilder Kent, which includes this project as well as some of our other projects, which some of you might have attended some of our other talks about. And the Chough Project is a really exciting example of how the two organisations work together so effectively. So Wildwood Trust, some of you might have visited the park near Canterbury, obviously has expertise in species, and Kent Wildlife Trust has expertise in land and habitat management. And so this Chough Project, where we're talking about introducing a species to managed land for wildlife, is a really obvious success of working together. We're also working in partnership with other organisations. So Paradise Park are a wildlife charity in Cornwall, and they've been breeding red-billed chough for decades now. So obviously a really important partner in this project. And English Heritage, who look after Dover Castle, have also become a partner in the project for reasons that, again, we're talking about in a bit more detail, but it's a really exciting link between our natural heritage, so our environment and the chough and the grassland in Dover, and our cultural heritage. And obviously English Heritage is puts emphasis on those cultural assets and how can we work together is really exciting. So we have a variety of objectives for the project that we'll just talk about briefly. In particular, the big one is to establish a new population of the red-billed chough in Dover for the first time in 250 years. It's going to take quite a while to get there. We're looking at about 10 years until we have a healthier population. We also want to work to develop best practices for a successful chough reintroduction. So a reintroduction successfully happened of chough in Jersey a couple of years ago now. So we're taking loads of their learning that Durrell Wildlife Trust developed and developing that further, and how can we improve so that the next project that comes along, they get to do it even more easily and even more successfully. We also need to continue to restore that grassland around Dover. So we're going to talk about the habitat that's really important for the chough. So obviously we need to restore that habitat. And this has been happening for decades now in Dover with Kent Wildlife Trust and other organisations to create and maintain this coastal chalk grassland, which the chough really need. Obviously we need to accelerate that and continue that momentum so more of that really important habitat is restored. We also need people to be involved. This project won't be a success if we just work in isolation. So we need to, and we are actively seeking participation from residents and local communities around Dover and the surroundings to support us and promote this project and hopefully bring benefits for them. And lastly, we have research objectives. So we have a variety of collaborations starting with research organisations and universities and so on to hopefully increase the understanding of chough ecology, so where they're found, what environments they found in, their husbandry, so how you look after them, how we manage those populations, and how we improve the success of these species reintroductions. So, Julia?
Yep, so this is a map of the current distribution of the red-billed chough. And so in total, we have about 250 to 350 pairs in Great Britain and about 120 to 150 pairs on the Isle of Man. There was actually a natural recolonisation event to Cornwall in 2001, and that's where a couple of chough from Ireland flew down to the Lizard. And since 2002, that pair have been breeding, and they've raised a total of 32 chicks so far, so they're doing quite well. And you'll also notice down near Jersey here, there's another cluster of chough, and that's due to a reintroduction project that the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust started in 2013. Okay. And so choughs were once widespread across the UK and Ireland, and inhabited at least 8 other English counties, including Cumbria, Devon, Dorset, Hampshire, Kent, Somerset, Sussex, and Yorkshire. But an east to west contraction in their range was underway by the start of the 19th century. And that's because the way that farming practices occurred changed. So agricultural intensification meant that their habitat wasn't so ideal anymore. And changes in land management, such as reduction in grazing of coastal slopes, which we'll come on to a little bit more about in a minute. And there was also the Preservation of Grain Act, which was started by Henry VIII, and that was to combat shortages in food and also increases in disease. So they set a list of animals that were considered vermin, of which the chough was one, and people would be paid to go out and kill them. So that really damaged their population numbers. And today they're still threatened by predation, by egg collecting, and also bad weather.
Sorry, my mouse has gone to sleep. Back. Right, so as you sort of alluded to, we're planning on reintroducing the chough to the coastlines around Dover. So these are some really stunning cliff-top habitats for the chough. And a really important question is why? Why are we reintroducing them to Dover? And a really important factor is because through considerable conservation work and habitat restoration for the last couple of decades, we are able to. So there was a time when lots of this cliff-top habitat was far more scrubbed over with far more sort of trees and scrubby habitats than even this photo shows. And this photo shows obviously quite a patch. Now, as we're going to talk about, chough need short grassland. They have quite a little beak and they they feed on soil invertebrates. So they would struggle to feed if you had a really high sward of grass. And short grassland, as some of you might know, is one of the most species-rich habitats the UK has, with a really high diversity of plants in sort of 1 square metre of grassland. And so because of that, it has high conservation value, but requires quite a bit of management to look after it. And through a lack of management and also through abandonment of land, there's been a lack of management of that grassland and an increase in the scrub and an increase in the tree cover. But because of lots and lots of conservation effort, we now have an increase in that short grassland, which means that we are able to bring back these chough to Dover. Other reasons why Dover is really important is because of the cliff habitat. So chough nest in crevices and nooks and crannies in cliffs, but occasionally in sort of other structures as well. And obviously the White Cliffs of Dover provide some of that nesting habitat that they need. But also, as sort of many of us know, Dover has a quite extensive military history. And because of that, there are loads of sort of pillboxes and other old buildings which can provide those crevices and nooks and crannies that chough may also choose to breed. So we've got habitat, we've got breeding sites, and lastly, there are some really impressive and exciting cultural links that link the chough to this part of Kent, this part of the south coast as well, which means that we can hopefully sort of resurrect and recreate those cultural links, which means there's even more value to bringing the chough back to this part of the world. And hopefully we can use those cultural links to bring more people on this journey with us, because obviously lots of people are really excited by the environment and are really sort of passionate about it, but not everybody. And we want as many people as possible to become custodians of looking after the chough. And so if we can shout about and get really excited about these cultural links as well as the benefit for the environment, hopefully we can bring more people on that journey. So hopefully this project will be more of a success. So, was there? Is someone having? Is it Julia? Am I clear? Is the connection?
I think we lost you a couple of times there.
Apologies, everybody. Is it better now?
It's okay for now, yes.
Okay, if I dip out, feel free to
Yeah,
carry on without.
I wasn't sure if it was my side or your side.
I was having issues with Teams earlier. I thought it was Teams rather than the internet, but apologies, everybody. Juliet, feel free to take the reins if I disappear. But I'll move on to the next slide. Right, do you want to take over?
Yep, so in Britain, the chough is mostly associated with coastal cliffs and slopes, such as the coastal cliffs of Dover, and also clifftop habitats that have short grassland pasture or bare earth. So they need that really short grassland for them to forage. And they also may be found in grassy or cultivated areas that have rocky crags, such as a picture at the bottom there. But they are very highly dependent on grazing management, and that is to do with their diet. So can I have the next slide, please? So the chough is a specialist feeder. They've got that really curved beak, and they use that to probe into the soil for insects such as beetles, earthworms, fly larvae, crane flies, ants, and also dung beetles. And so another reason that grazing animals are beneficial for the chough is that the animal dung is a source of food for the choughs because it attracts all the insects in, and the chough can then feed off of that. And during the autumn and winter months, arable land is important for the chough, where they will eat the grain from the stubble fields and forage for invertebrates in the open soil, and they'll also eat small berries as well. I think we have a video to show you. So you can see the chough probing into the soil there with its beak.
Should we stop it there?
Yeah. Okay, so in terms of breeding, choughs are usually monogamous, but as with most things, there are some exceptions to the rule. In terms of courtship, the chough will perform quite aerobatic aerial displays, and nest sites will be things like cliff crevices, cliff caves and ledges. Also, they would nest in boxes, which is something that we would be able to provide if there aren't enough natural nesting habitats. And they've also been known to nest in some old buildings as well. And their nests are quite large and untidy. We've got an image of it just on the right here. And they're made of twigs and roots and moss, and sometimes bound with mud. They can be lined with wool as well that they might find from the sheep that are grazing nearby. And the nest tends to be built by both sexes. They'll lay their first eggs somewhere around April to May, and that will be about 3 to 5 eggs, which are about 39 by 28 millimeters across and weigh about 15.7 grams. The eggs will be incubated for between 17 to 18 days, and then the chicks will fledge at about 5 to 6 weeks old. So the juveniles will have a much duller beak than the adults, so it will be more of a yellow-orange, and they'll develop the bright red as they grow older. For a few days after they leave the nest, the fledgling choughs will have a period known as bouldering, and that's sort of like the branching stage of tree nesting corvids. So that's where the young are left behind by their adults, and they will sort of hide away in the rock fissures, in rabbit burrows, and under large boulders. And they seem to enjoy playing in the thermal currents as well, practicing their flying, performing dives and swoops. And you tend to see that the choughs are divided into 2 separate social groups. So there'll be a group of breeding adults and flocks, also including sub-adults and non-breeders together as well. And these flocks can contain hundreds of birds, and each group actually has a hierarchy as well. So the choughs can then coexist and feed together without too many problems. But the young need between 2 and 3 years within their flock to sort of work out their status and gain that status for them to then become adults. They're also very sedentary birds as well, so they don't tend to move more than about 12 miles away from where they are born, but the longest journey that's ever been recorded was 45 miles.
Okay, so an important part of the Chough Project is to captively breed these birds. So there is a captive population, as we mentioned, at Paradise Park, and Wildwood also have a captive population. And it's these individuals that will be breeding and their young that will be being released. So Paradise Park has been managing a sort of genetically diverse population for about 3 decades now. And this is now part of the European Endangered Species Programme. So there have been husbandry techniques, so how you look after these birds, being developed by Paradise Park. And these have then been developed further by individuals at Darwin Conservation and Wildlife Trust when we're talking about how you get these animals ready for release into the wild. And then our colleagues at Wildwood Trust will hopefully be developing these even further and furthering our knowledge about captive breeding, but also about crash rearing and release techniques. So last year at Wildwood, the individuals, the babies that were born from the chough pair at Wildwood were crash reared, and their individuals, their young, were then installed in an aviary that's at Dover Castle, and we're returning this summer. And it will be those skills and techniques that are going to be used in future years to rear chough for the release programme. So, sort of as we've spoken about, rearing and releasing birds is a really important part of this process and is all involved in developing new techniques. So in the very near future, additional aviaries are being constructed at Wildwood as part of this increasing the capacity of the breeding programme. We're also going to need to be constructing a release aviary. So this is the aviary from which the birds will be properly released into the wild. As already mentioned, the colleagues at Wildwood have been developing those crash rearing techniques and also something called double clutching. So when a pair lays an egg, if that egg is then taken away, can then captively rear that chick, and that pair can also rear another one. So we'll also be releasing these birds in cohorts, so together releasing individuals together, releasing individuals together, too many times. And something called recall training. So this is where the birds can be trained to come back to a place via a signal. So keepers at Wildwood have been working on, or in the past been working on this, and will be working on this again with the birds reared this year. And this is really, really important for that post-release management. So we're going to need to know when these birds are released into the wild, are they doing okay? An important part of that is that we can get them back to the aviary if need be. We're also going to be able to monitor if the birds are surviving by GPS tracking. So you can attach really small trackers to different places on birds, sometimes on their back, with like a little backpack. And that GPS tracking can tell us where those birds are at a period of time. But this obviously requires considerable staff time and capacity to follow these birds around. And lastly, one of the new techniques that's been developed in the past, and we're going to be furthering that development, is nest boxes. So I think Juliet mentioned that we might be putting up additional nest boxes if the capacity in the environment isn't high enough. So those next boxes we put in places to ensure those birds are able to breed in the wild if needed. So do you want to start us off with the cultural heritage, Julia?
Yeah, can do. So there's quite a few different links, which is, as we mentioned, one of the reasons that we want to reintroduce the chough to Dover. So first of all, we've got the link to Shakespeare. So in King Lear, he mentions the crows and choughs that wing the midway air above the cliffs of Dover. And also, there's a bit of a sort of story about how the chough supposedly got its red legs and its red beak, which is that when Thomas Becket was murdered in the cathedral at Canterbury, a crow flew down and walked in his blood, and that's how the chough became about and got its red legs and its red beak. Do you want to talk about the kings, Alicia?
Yeah, sure. So as Juliet mentioned, the origin of the chough is said to be when Thomas à Becket was murdered in Canterbury Cathedral. And this is thought to have led to the coat of arms of Canterbury, which is here in the bottom left, having the three choughs on it. So the story goes that Henry II, who was on the throne when Thomas à Becket was Archbishop, he didn't like the church, and he wanted to have control over the church as part of the state rather than being separate, which is what led to Thomas à Becket's murder. But then shortly after his murder, the chough appeared on the coat of arms. And then if we fast forward a couple of hundred years, and that link had sort of been forgotten. And so then Henry VIII was on the throne, and he liked the church even less than Henry II. And he wanted to have, as I'm sure many of you know, considerable control over the church rather than it being separate. And so because Thomas à Becket had become a bit of this cult figure about the independence of the church, he said that all references to Thomas à Becket must be removed. And so people were doing that. They were removing references to Thomas à Becket. And there used to be the seal of the city of Canterbury, a bit like a stamp, was the martyrdom scene of Thomas à Becket, so him being murdered in the cathedral. But because this new ruling had come in that said you can't have any references to Thomas à Becket, so that was removed and it was replaced with the three choughs. And it's not known whether that's because it was just an error and people didn't really know the link between the chough and Thomas à Becket, and it was like, oh, well, we'll just put this instead, or whether it was a sort of subtle rebellion against Henry VIII's ruling because the chough had this link to Thomas à Becket. So it was a bit of a, well, we're going to do it anyway. But it wasn't recognised, and the seal is still the three choughs. It's kind of cool. And so obviously still today, you can see the choughs on the coat of arms of Canterbury. And if you're in the cathedral, you find them in the funniest places, up in the eaves, all throughout the cathedral, really. But they also appear in other places in Kent. And that link also links us to Dover, because at Dover Castle, there is the Becket Chapel. And a historian did a lot of research not that long ago, actually, about what was the prompt for Dover Castle becoming such a heavily fortified building that's been sort of ever increasingly fortified over the years. And so if we again go back to the time of Henry II, when Thomas à Becket was murdered, because Thomas à Becket became this cult figure, there started to be people who were taking pilgrimage from Europe, continental Europe, up to the UK. And some of these were really high profile figures. And so Henry II had to go and meet various individuals as the king. But there was nowhere in Kent at the time that was thought to be fit for a king to stay. I think there's a sort of a story that the first time he went down, he had to stay in like a pub in Canterbury, and that was heaven forbid, really, if you're the king. And so because of this, Dover Castle was a very convenient place for people to take pilgrimage up to Canterbury. Previously, they were most of the journeys from France to the UK were sort of Portsmouth way rather than Kent. And so because of this, like, okay, we need to increase the construction at Dover Castle and make it this very sort of awe-inspiring and dominant building on the coast. Thought that maybe that was the signal, that was the trigger rather. So then you again have this link of the Chough and Thomas à Becket taking us down to Dover as well as in Canterbury, which is really cool. So I think we are coming to the end of our presentation.
Yes.
Lastly, I have forgotten. Sorry, Juliet.
So hopefully this summer there will be some Chough near you. So if you've not seen them in person already, there's currently an aviary at Wildwood Trust with the adults and also our sort of teenage Chough now, I suppose, Pyro, Vera, Eleanor and Beckett. It's really nice to go and watch them. They've got their own distinctive personalities. And we should be releasing our Choughs this summer after the adults have bred this spring. And evidence from previous reintroduction projects like the one at Jersey has shown that the best time to release the Chough is post-fledge, when they'd naturally be forming their flocks with other juvenile birds anyway. So that should be somewhere maybe around August time when they're ready to be released there. And also a mix of bold and more timid birds tend to work well as well. So yes, they do have their own personalities.